I never imagined that Christmas Eve would end with me lying motionless in a frozen yard while the people inside the house I once called home continued eating dinner as if nothing had happened. I was 32 years old, a trained emergency room nurse who had spent a decade facing trauma, frostbite, and broken bodies. Yet nothing in my professional life prepared me for the moment my own father would push me out of a second-floor window during a holiday dinner. When I returned to Fairbanks a month earlier, I told myself it would only be temporary, just long enough for my injured hand to heal and for my finances to stabilize after my medical leave gutted my savings. The truth was more complicated. I had nowhere else to go. Rent in Seattle was impossible to maintain without a full-time job, and the workers' compensation claim for my hand injury was still in review. My father Martin knew all of this. He knew I had no other option but to return, and he welcomed me with the same cold control I remembered from childhood, pretending it was generosity. His house sat near the end of an unpaved road where most neighbors stayed inside once the snow fell, and by Christmas week, the temperature had already dropped to -10 degrees Celsius well before sunset. It was the kind of cold that made the air feel sharp enough to slice skin. The house looked warm and perfect from the outside, its windows glowing with soft yellow light and its porch decorated with garlands and a fake pine wreath Denise insisted on buying from an expensive shop downtown. Denise was my stepmother in title, but nothing more than a performance of politeness that dissolved the moment no one else was around. Her daughter Lily, 10 years younger than me and spoiled by years of praise from Martin, never hesitated to remind me that I was the outsider in the very house where I grew up. When I walked downstairs that evening wearing the only dress that still fit me comfortably, I could already feel the tension pooling in the air. Martin had invited 2 of his business partners for dinner, men he constantly bragged to about his success. He wanted a perfect holiday tableau, a flawless family image that made him look respectable. My presence in his mind threatened that. He hated that my return to Fairbanks meant I was not succeeding somewhere else where he did not have to witness it. Dinner began with strained smiles and polite conversation. I kept my injured hand tucked close to my side, hoping no one would notice the slight tremor that still appeared when I gripped objects for too long. For a moment, I believed I could blend into the background and survive the evening, but Lily made sure that did not happen. She leaned back in her chair, flipping her perfect blonde hair as she flashed a rehearsed smile at the guests. "So, Emily," she said loudly, "I heard you are not working right now. Something about an accident in the emergency room." Her tone carried the same sugar-coated malice I had endured since she was a child. The table fell silent. All eyes turned to me. I forced a smile and said it was temporary, that I planned to return to work soon. Denise let out a laugh that did not match the pleasant expression on her face. "Poor thing, she said it must be hard losing your grip." I felt heat crawl up my neck, but I swallowed it down. I had promised myself I would not react. I would not ruin the night. When Martin asked me to pour wine for his guests, I nodded and reached for the bottle with my left hand, the one that still tired quickly. The tremor appeared almost instantly. The bottle slipped from my fingers just enough for the wine to splash onto the linen tablecloth. Not a full spill, just enough to stain. A small accident. Yet the room reacted as if I had set the table on fire. The business partners exchanged uncomfortable glances. Lily covered her mouth in dramatic shock. Denise whispered something to Martin, something sharp enough that his jaw tightened. In that moment, I saw it, the shame spreading across my father's face like a storm cloud. He stood abruptly and grabbed my arm. His grip was tight, not enough to bruise, but enough to send a clear message. He muttered through clenched teeth that I was humiliating him. Before I could protest, he pulled me toward the stairs, forcing me up to the second-floor landing. I heard Denise laugh lightly, trying to smooth the awkwardness for the guests downstairs. Once we reached the hallway, Martin shoved me away from him and demanded to know why I could not simply act normal for one evening. I told him my hand still hurt and that accidents happen. He stepped closer, the scent of scotch drifting from his breath, and I felt the old fear rise in my chest. He accused me of doing it on purpose, of trying to embarrass him. I told him I was not interested in competing with his pride, and that was true. I was tired. Tired of bending myself into shapes that pleased him. Something inside me snapped, not in anger, but in exhaustion. I said quietly, "I am not your shadow." That was it. That was the line that ignited him. His face twisted in a way I had not seen since I was a teenager. Without warning, he shoved me backward. I felt the window behind me before I understood what was happening, the cold glass pressing into my shoulder blades. A second later, it shattered. The world tilted. My body fell through shards that caught the faint light from the room behind us. I heard nothing but wind, a sudden roar of freezing air as it filled my lungs. Then the impact. The snow looked soft from above, but it was packed solid from days of storms. Pain exploded through my back and ribs. I could not breathe. I could not move. My limbs felt like they were separating from me, as if my mind and body no longer belonged to the same person. Above me, the broken window framed Martin's silhouette. He stared down for a moment, then reached for the curtains and pulled them closed. The warm glow from inside vanished. Darkness swallowed me whole. That was the moment terror settled fully into my bones. I lay motionless in -10 degrees Celsius, wondering if I would die before anyone even noticed I was gone. The first thing I noticed after the shock faded was the sound of my own breathing, shallow and uneven, as if the cold air refused to fully enter my lungs. The ground beneath me was harder than concrete, an icy crust formed from days of storms packing the snow into something closer to stone than powder. I tried to lift my head, but pain shot through my neck and down my spine, a burning line that warned me not to move. My training as an emergency room nurse kicked in even as panic spread through me. I knew the early symptoms of hypothermia better than most people. I had seen patients come in after collapsing on the side of a highway or getting lost during winter hikes, their skin waxy and pale, their bodies trembling as they tried desperately to stay awake. I had guided families through the terrifying wait to see if blood circulation would return to numb fingers. I never imagined I would become one of those patients lying helpless in -10 degrees Celsius with no one rushing to save me. At first, I could still feel the sting of the wind slicing across my cheeks and the sharp pulse of pain from my ribs. I tried to curl my fingers, hoping I could at least create some friction, but only my thumb moved twitching weakly against the snow. My right hand, the injured one, felt like a block of ice. A part of me wondered if I had broken something during the fall. The rest of me was too afraid to find out. I forced myself to remain calm. Panic increased heart rate, and a fast heartbeat burned through precious energy. I knew conserving heat was the only thing standing between me and a body temperature drop that could turn fatal. I tried to angle my face away from the wind, but my body refused to cooperate. I was stuck exactly as I had landed, arms half spread, one leg bent awkwardly beneath me. I could not see the window I fell from, but I could hear muted voices drifting down from inside the house. They sounded close, yet impossibly far away, like a memory I could not fully reach. After a few minutes, the voices grew clearer. Someone had pulled aside a curtain just enough for the light inside to spill faintly onto the snow. Through that narrow angle, I saw the silhouettes of Martin and Denise standing near the window. Denise's hands moved rapidly as she whispered in an urgent tone. Martin's posture was stiff. I could not hear every word, but I caught fragments. Things like "not now" and "keep calm," and "she will get up on her own." My chest tightened. They were talking about me not with fear, but with irritation, like someone annoyed by a spilled drink. The curtain fell shut again. The light vanished. I was alone. The cold found every gap in my clothing. My dress, thin and made for indoor warmth, offered no protection. Snow began to settle on my shoulders and hair melting just enough to seep through the fabric before freezing again. My breathing grew slower. I recognized the pattern immediately. Stage 1, hypothermia. Shivering, rapid heartbeat, numb fingers. I did not want to think about stage 2 when shivering would stop and confusion would set in. People often believed stopping shivering meant improvement, but it meant the opposite. It meant the body was giving up. I whispered to myself, trying to stay awake. Focus on vitals, airway still clear, breathing shallow but regular, circulation compromised but present. I repeated the assessment again and again until my teeth began chattering too hard for me to speak. I tried to count to 10, then 20, then 30, anything to keep my mind active, but time felt strange. Minutes stretched and twisted until I could not tell if 10 seconds or 10 minutes had passed between breaths. A faint sound pulled my attention upward. Laughter. Lily's laughter. She was live streaming again the same holiday show she had been broadcasting earlier. I could not see her through the window, but I heard her speak brightly to her followers, her voice muffled by glass and curtains. She talked about Christmas dinner, about how beautiful the table setting looked, about how she hoped to spend next year in California. At one point she laughed and said something about me being dramatic earlier, but the words were muffled by the wind and I could not make out the full sentence. What struck me was not what she said, but how casually she said it, as if her half-sister was not lying outside in the freezing dark. I wanted to call out. I tried. My mouth opened, but the only sound was a weak breath that disappeared into the wind. The cold was settling deeper now, threading itself through my muscles and bones. My jaw trembled uncontrollably. My eyelids felt heavy. I kept telling myself to stay awake. Stay awake. Stay awake. I had seen too many patients slip away simply because they grew too tired to fight. I refused to become one of them. I needed to find something to focus on, something to anchor myself. I looked at my right hand curled awkwardly against the snow and forced myself to examine it clinically. I flexed my thumb again. Good. Movement present. I tried to flex my fingers. Nothing. Not good. Circulation compromised. I willed myself to try again, knowing even the smallest movement could buy me minutes. My hand twitched barely perceptible, but movement nonetheless. It was enough to keep me conscious a little longer. Then a sudden gust of wind dragged snow across my face. It felt like needles. I squeezed my eyes shut to block the sting, but the darkness behind my eyelids made me feel as if I were sinking into something deep and heavy. I knew what was coming. Hallucinations. Memory distortions. The brain's desperate attempt to stay awake while the body shut down. I inhaled sharply, forcing myself to stay grounded. I whispered my name, then my birthday, then my address, the same mental check I used on confused patients. My voice cracked, but the words kept me tethered to reality. I had survived countless emergencies. I could survive this. I had to. The cold did not care about determination, though. It pushed deeper, stealing warmth, one heartbeat at a time. Somewhere inside the house, music began playing again, soft holiday classics that floated through the air like a cruel reminder of where I should have been. A place of warmth. A place of family. Instead, I lay half buried in snow, fighting to stay alive. That was when I realized something that sent a new kind of chill through me. No one was coming. Not Martin. Not Denise. Not Lily. No one inside that house cared whether I lived or died. If I wanted to survive the next hour, I had only myself. When people hear stories about abusive parents, they often imagine bruises or raised voices, but the truth is that control can take quieter shapes, the kind that slip into a household like a cold draft. No one notices until everyone is shivering, without knowing why. My childhood with Martin began like any other daughter and father pair in a small Alaskan town. He was strict but proud, a man who expected excellence and worked long hours at his growing freight company. My mother Laura was the soft warmth that balanced him, the source of every gentle moment I remember from before everything changed. She braided my hair for school, tucked handwritten notes in my lunchbox, and sang to me whenever winter storms knocked out the power. When I was very young, I believed my family was ordinary. I thought my parents loved each other the way couples in Christmas movies did, and for a time that was true. But when my mother was diagnosed with cancer, something inside Martin began to twist. The more she weakened, the more he tightened his grip on everything around him, including me. He began monitoring my homework with the precision of a drill sergeant, timing how long each assignment should take and rewriting entire pages if my penmanship was not sharp enough. My mother would protest from her chair in the living room, telling him I was just a child, but he would silence her with a single look. After she passed away when I was 14, his control stopped being a crack in the foundation and became the entire structure of the house. I grieved for my mother, but I also grieved for a version of myself that no longer existed. Without her buffer, I had no shield. Martin remarried 6 months later, long before I had processed the loss. Denise arrived with bright smiles and overdone cheerfulness that reminded me of people who talked loudly to hide their insecurities. She moved into our home with her daughter Lily, a toddler at the time, and from the first day, she treated me less like a stepdaughter and more like an obstacle that interrupted her perfect family picture. Martin adored the attention she gave him, and slowly the house that once smelled of my mother's cooking began to smell like designer candles and expensive perfumes. I tried to keep the peace during those early years, but every attempt seemed to reinforce Martin's belief that controlling me was not only acceptable, but necessary. If I earned an A-, he called it a failure. If I spoke too quietly, he told me I lacked confidence. If I spoke too boldly, he accused me of disrespect. I learned to read his moods the way some kids learned to read textbooks, memorizing every sign that might predict an outburst. One memory stands out more sharply than the others. I was 15 and had just received a report card with all A grades except for one B+ in geometry. It was not even a low B+, but Martin reacted as if I had deliberately ruined his reputation. He told me that average people earned B grades and that I was not born to be average. When I tried to explain that I had studied hard, he opened the back door and pointed outside. He told me to stand on the porch until I understood what disappointment felt like. It was late autumn, cold enough that my breath turned to fog. I stood there for what felt like an hour, not daring to move because I could see his silhouette through the kitchen window. He stood with his arms crossed, watching me through the glass as if waiting for something inside me to crack. When he finally opened the door, he said nothing. He simply turned off the porch light and walked away. I never mentioned the incident to anyone at school. I convinced myself it was my fault. That belief became the pattern of my teenage years. When Denise criticized the way I folded laundry, I apologized. When Martin snapped because I forgot to pick Lily up after soccer practice, I apologized even though no one had told me she had a game. Apologizing became my currency, a way to buy temporary peace in a household built on tension. Yet there were moments when I felt the ghost of my mother urging me to stand straighter. Sometimes I would find one of her old scarves tucked in a drawer, still carrying the faint scent of her lavender lotion, and grief would hit me so hard I could barely breathe. I longed for her voice, the only voice that ever made me feel safe. But grieving in a house that had replaced every trace of her felt like grieving in a museum where touching anything was forbidden. As the years passed, the control sharpened. Martin monitored my friendships, claiming certain kids were a bad influence. He dismissed my dream of studying nursing, insisting I take business classes to join his company someday. When I packed my bags for Seattle at 18, he stood in the doorway of my room with an expression that was not sadness but indignation. He told me I would come crawling back one day. I believed he was wrong. I believed I could build a life far from his shadow. For a while I did. I excelled in nursing school, found work in a busy emergency room, and surrounded myself with colleagues who felt like family. But even then, there were nights when I caught myself apologizing too quickly or shrinking from conflict without knowing why. The conditioning of my childhood clung to me like invisible threads. I tried to cut them, but the edges of those threads ran deeper than I understood. I did not realize how deep until the night I fell from that window. That fall was not the beginning of my suffering. It was simply the embodiment of everything I had endured for years condensed into one violent moment. A moment that made me confront the truth I had avoided since childhood. Martin had never needed fists to control me. He had built his power slowly, consistently, with subtle punishments that taught me obedience. That night was only the final lesson. Leaving Alaska at 18 felt like stepping out of a cage I had spent my entire life pretending was a home. I remember sitting on the plane to Seattle with a $200 envelope of tips from the diner where I worked weekends and a single suitcase filled mostly with clothes my mother had bought me years before she died. I stared out the airplane window at the endless white landscape below, promising myself I would never return to my father's house. Not even for holidays, not even if he begged. Seattle felt like a different planet from the moment I stepped off the plane. The city buzzed with people who did not know my name, who did not care that I came from a house where perfection was demanded instead of love. I fell in love with the anonymity. I enrolled in a nursing program at a community college and picked up every shift I could find to pay tuition. I worked in coffee shops, tended bar on weekends, and cleaned offices late at night. None of it felt heavy because it was mine. Every dollar earned without Martin's voice attached to it felt like a piece of freedom sliding into place. When I was accepted into a hospital-sponsored emergency room training program, I cried so hard in my small dorm room that my roommate thought something terrible had happened. In a way, something had happened. I had discovered the version of myself that had been buried under years of criticism. The work was intense. I spent nights running between trauma bays, assisting with intubations, stabilizing accident victims, and comforting families who hovered between hope and despair. I saw things most people never forget: blood-soaked hallways, frantic chest compressions, the quiet stillness after a failed resuscitation. Yet through it all, I found a strange sense of purpose. Chaos made sense to me. I understood emergencies in a way I never understood my own family. The staff became my second family, especially Carla, a senior nurse who taught me everything from how to advocate for a patient to how to keep my composure when things fell apart. She once told me that I had the heart of someone who had been holding broken things her entire life. I never told her how true that felt. For 10 years, I built a life in that hospital. I found an apartment with a view of the water saved money, bought a reliable used car, and even went on a few dates, though none ever lasted long. The independence I once feared became the one thing I trusted. Then everything changed during a night shift last winter. A patient came in with a deep stab wound, bleeding heavily and panicking. I reached out to apply pressure, but he jerked suddenly and my right hand took the full force of the movement. Something cracked. I felt it instantly. Pain shot through my wrist and fingers. The next morning, an orthopedic specialist told me I had torn several tendons and would need surgery, followed by months of physical therapy. I sat in the clinic parking lot and cried quietly because I knew what months without working meant. No income, no stability, no backup plan. I filed for workers' compensation, but the process was slow and filled with delays. Bills piled up faster than approvals. Rent became unmanageable. My savings shrank to almost nothing. I held on for as long as I could, but eventually the numbers stopped adding up. Every option closed one by one until only one remained: returning to Fairbanks. I dreaded calling Martin, but he answered the phone with surprising enthusiasm, as if my struggles confirmed something he had predicted all along. He told me I could come home until I got back on my feet, but he said it with a pointed softness that carried conditions. I knew those conditions even before he spoke them: his rules, his house, his expectations. The closer the plane got to Alaska, the tighter my chest became. Stepping off onto the icy tarmac felt like stepping backward in time. Martin greeted me with a stiff embrace that reminded me I was not returning to a parent, but to a warden who believed he had been proven right. Denise hugged me with the dramatic sweetness that dissolved the moment Martin looked away, and Lily hardly acknowledged me at all except to comment on how tired I looked. The house was exactly as I remembered, and yet worse. It smelled of polished wood and cold silence, the kind of silence that carried warnings. I told myself I could endure it for a month. Just a month. Long enough for my hand to heal and my claim to be approved. But the longer I stayed, the more I felt the old tension sewing itself back into my bones. Martin monitored everything I did. If I slept too late, he commented on laziness. If I went for a walk, he asked where and why. If I reheated leftovers, he made a remark about waste. I tried to help around the house, but Denise always found a way to make my efforts seem clumsy or intrusive, as if I were trespassing in rooms that had once belonged to my mother. Lily mocked my hand injury, openly asking if I dropped things at work the same way I dropped things at home. I told myself I could ignore it. I was an adult now, not the frightened girl who once stood on the porch in the cold. Yet being in that house made me feel 14 again. Every comment scraped old wounds. Every silent dinner revived memories of the expectations that had suffocated me. Still, I stayed because survival has a way of making even the most painful places seem tolerable when pride is too expensive to afford. I thought I could pretend long enough to escape again. I did not realize how wrong I was until Christmas Eve showed me just how fragile my escape had always been. Christmas Eve in Martin's house had always been a performance rather than a celebration, but that year, the pressure to appear perfect felt heavier than ever. In the days leading up to the holiday, Denise decorated every inch of the living room with expensive ornaments she ordered online, insisting the house needed to look picture perfect for the guests Martin had invited. She bought a fake pine tree that was taller than any real tree could fit through the doorway and layered it with lights so bright they washed the entire room in a glow that felt more staged than festive. Lily filmed everything for her social media account, talking about family traditions she had invented for the sake of her followers. She walked past me with her phone held high, narrating in a cheerful tone, while giving me a fleeting glance that said I was not part of any of it. I tried to stay out of the way that morning, focusing on simple tasks like peeling potatoes or reheating cranberry sauce, hoping the small contributions would help the evening pass smoothly. When I placed a platter on the counter, Denise hovered behind me, moving the plate slightly to the left, then to the right, as if my placement offended her sense of order. "You do not have to help," she said sweetly. "Just relax." The words sounded kind, but her eyes carried a flicker of annoyance that made it clear she preferred if I simply disappeared. By late afternoon, Martin was pacing across the kitchen, checking timers and giving instructions, acting more like an executive preparing for a board meeting than a man hosting a family dinner. The business partners he invited were men he admired and envied, at the same time men he desperately wanted to impress. He spent the past month discussing the importance of that dinner, describing it as an opportunity to show stability, success, and a loving family. I knew my presence threatened that illusion, even if he never said it directly. When I stepped into the dining room just before the guests arrived, I noticed how carefully the table had been arranged. Every fork aligned perfectly, every napkin folded into identical pointed shapes. I was about to sit when Denise placed a hand on my shoulder and whispered, "Try not to draw attention to yourself tonight." The guests arrived just as the sun dipped below the horizon, plunging the town into early winter darkness. Martin greeted them with a booming laugh that echoed through the hallway. He introduced Denise and Lily with pride, then gestured to me with a polite, almost dismissive smile. "This is Emily," he said, "my daughter who is visiting for the holidays." He did not mention my decade of emergency room work or my accomplishments. He did not mention the injury or the months of recovery. He simply introduced me as if I were a distant cousin passing through. I took my seat at the far end of the table and tried to blend into the glow of the candles. Dinner began with polite conversation about business deals, travel plans, and the challenges of winter shipping routes. I listened quietly, eating small bites of ham and roasted vegetables while trying to keep my injured hand hidden beneath the table. Then, as if she had been waiting for the perfect moment, Lily leaned forward with a sugary smile and said to one of the guests, "You know Emily used to work in an emergency room." Used to being the key word. She said it lightly, but with enough emphasis that the men at the table turned their attention to me. One of them raised an eyebrow and asked if I was taking a break from nursing. Before I could answer, Lily continued, "She hurt her hand in some accident or something. Now she kind of drops things. It just happens." I felt my cheeks warm. My first instinct was to explain the truth that a patient had panicked and jerked unexpectedly, causing the injury, but I knew Lily would twist anything I said into another dig. I forced a smile and told the guests it was temporary. Denise chuckled softly, swirling her wine. "Poor thing. She means well," she said. "Sometimes she just gets overwhelmed." I felt something sink inside my chest. Those words were not said for the guests. They were ammunition directed at me. When Martin gave me a sharp look and nodded toward the wine bottle, I understood what he wanted. Serve, contribute, make up for the disaster he believed I caused by existing at his table. My hand trembled the moment my fingers wrapped around the bottle. I tried to steady it, tightening my grip, but the strain sent a familiar ache through my wrist. Before I could adjust, the bottle tilted slightly, and a thin stream of red wine spilled across the tablecloth. It was not a large spill, barely enough to stain the linen, but the reaction was immediate. Denise gasped as if I had toppled the entire table. One of the business partners froze mid-sentence. Lily widened her eyes in theatrical disbelief. Martin inhaled sharply, the muscle in his jaw tightening as if he had swallowed rage. I whispered an apology, reaching for a napkin, but Martin stood abruptly and grabbed my arm with a force that startled even the guests. He mumbled something about needing a moment and pulled me away from the table before I could gather my thoughts. His fingers dug into my skin as he dragged me toward the stairs, his voice low and cold, telling me I was embarrassing him, telling me I could not even pour a drink correctly. At the foot of the staircase, I tried to explain, telling him my hand still hurt, that it had only been a small spill, that accidents happen, but none of it mattered. He did not want understanding. He wanted control. He pulled me up the stairs with long, fast strides, ignoring my pleas to slow down. When we reached the second-floor landing, he released my arm only long enough to slam the door of the hallway behind us. His face was flushed with anger, his breathing heavy. "Why do you always have to ruin everything?" he hissed. I told him I was not trying to ruin anything. I told him I was doing my best. He stepped closer, eyes narrowing. "Your best is never enough." Something inside me cracked. I said, "I am not your shadow." His expression darkened instantly, as if those words confirmed every resentment he had built toward me. He took one step forward, then another, and in a single motion shoved me backward. The glass shattered. The cold swallowed me. Christmas Eve became a nightmare that echoed every warning my childhood had whispered to me. The moment my father's hands made contact with my shoulders, everything happened too fast for my mind to process in a linear way. 1 second, I was standing on the landing, my breath tight in my chest, and the next, I felt the backward momentum pull me away from the warmth of the hallway. There was no warning, no pause, no flash of regret in his eyes. His shove was not measured or controlled, but a sudden burst of anger fueled by wine pride and years of unspoken resentment. I remember the sensation of my heels sliding against the hardwood floor, and then the horrifying realization that the window frame behind me was approaching faster than I could react. My trained instincts told me to twist my body to catch myself to brace, but my injured hand reacted a fraction too late. The glass gave way with a sharp, crystalline sound that cut through the silence in a way that still echoes in my memory. I felt the cold air rush across my back before I even understood I was falling. The world outside was a blur of white snow and dark sky, a spinning canvas of winter and fear. Gravity pulled me downward before I could scream. When my body hit the ground, the impact stole every breath from my lungs. I felt my spine jolt and my ribs explode with pain, not sharp, but crushing, as though the earth itself had folded around me. For a moment, I could not tell if my eyes were open or closed. One thought pulsed through my head over and over again. "Do not move, do not move." My training fought with my terror. I needed to assess my injuries before I shifted even an inch. I tried to inhale, but the cold stabbed my chest like needles. My fingers twitched involuntarily, my legs numb beneath me. The snow cradled me with deceptive softness, but beneath the surface was frozen ground as unforgiving as stone. As I lay there staring at a sky that seemed impossibly far away, I heard the crunch of footsteps in the snow above, near the broken window. My father's silhouette appeared. His head leaned forward slightly as if checking to see where I had landed. His shadow stretched across the wall behind him, long and distorted. Denise stepped beside him. Their voices floated down muted and muffled by wind and distance. I could not make out every word, but I heard enough. She fell. "She is fine. Stay calm." Her tone was clipped, almost rehearsed, like someone trying to contain a problem rather than help a person. Martin's reply was quiet and trembling. I recognized the tremor not as fear for me, but fear of consequences. For a second, he looked as though he might come down to check on me. But then Denise touched his arm, gave him some hushed instruction, and he pulled the curtains shut without another glance. The house lights vanished. I was alone. The cold seeped into my bones with frightening speed. My dress, thin and never meant for winter weather, clung to my skin as the snow beneath me melted slightly from body heat, then refroze. My breathing became shallow. Every inhale burned. I tried to lift my right hand, the one already damaged from the workplace accident, but a wave of pain radiated through my wrist and down my forearm. I wondered if I had fractured something during the fall. My left hand managed a subtle curl, barely a motion at all, but enough to reassure me that mobility was still present. My legs were another story. They felt distant, heavy, locked in place by the cold and by the awkward angle of my landing. I tested movement gently, just enough to see if nerves responded. A faint tremor. Not much else. Panic crawled up my spine, threatening to take over, but I forced my mind to focus. I whispered to myself silently, airway clear, breathing slow, pulse faint but present, hypothermia risk extreme. I needed warmth. I needed shelter. I needed someone to notice I was gone. Yet inside that house, no one was calling my name. No one was checking the yard. No one was stepping outside with a coat or a flashlight. Instead, I heard faint music drifting from inside, muffled Christmas melodies that contrasted so cruelly with the reality unfolding outside. I turned my head slightly, only enough to see the edge of the house, and noticed the lights flickering as people moved around the dining room. Chairs, scraped dishes, clinked, laughter rose and fell as if the evening had resumed without interruption. They were celebrating dinner a few feet from where I lay, unable to sit up or cry for help. My father had not intended to kill me. I believed that much, but he had intended to silence me. He had intended to show me that my voice held no power in his world. He had intended to remind me that the house belonged to him and I was merely a guest whose presence mattered only when convenient. The wind cut across my cheeks again, harsher this time. Tiny flakes of snow swirled around me, landing on my eyelashes and melting into cold droplets that slid down toward my ears. I wanted to wipe them away, but my arms refused to lift. My mind, desperate to stay present, replayed the last few seconds before the shove. His face tight with anger. My words spoken too quietly to be a challenge, but clearly enough to ignite something deep inside him. I am not your shadow. That sentence had been inside me for years, waiting for a crack in my fear to escape. I had not expected it to provoke violence, but perhaps I should have. My entire life had been shaped by his need for control. Losing control, especially in front of his business partners, was a humiliation he could not tolerate. I understood that now with bleak clarity. As the cold tightened around me like a vice, I realized something else. He had not checked on me because checking meant acknowledging that something irreversible had happened. He needed to believe I would stand up and brush myself off, that the evening would continue without repercussions. That belief allowed him to pull the curtains and walk away. I lay there in the dark, the sky above swirling with faint stars, wondering if I would die in the same town I had once fought so hard to leave. My breath formed small clouds that drifted upward and disappeared into the night. My thoughts began to slow, each one stretching into the next like a fading echo. The fall had taken only seconds, but the consequences were stretching into an eternity. I felt the last reserves of warmth slipping away, and for the first time since hitting the ground, I thought clearly without panic or denial. If help did not come soon, I would not survive the night. The longer I lay in the snow, the more the sounds inside the house sharpened into something surreal, as if every noise passed it through a filter that distorted warmth into cruelty. I could not move my head anymore, but I could hear almost everything. At first, there were footsteps overhead, hurried and uneven, followed by Denise's voice, rising in a whisper that was sharp enough to reach me even through the wall. I heard her say that I was being dramatic earlier and that I probably wandered off to sulk. Then Martin's heavy steps moved across the floorboards above me, pacing back and forth in a frantic rhythm that betrayed the fear he refused to show anyone. The window above me remained covered, but faint cracks of light leaked from the edges whenever someone passed by. Each passing shadow reminded me of my helplessness. I waited for someone to open the back door or call my name, anything that meant I had not been discarded entirely. Instead, I heard the sound of chairs scraping against the floor. Dinner was resuming. The guests were settling back into their seats. I tried to listen more closely, focusing my fading energy on their muffled voices. One of the guests asked where I had gone. His tone held mild concern, the polite sort of worry a person expresses at a party when someone excuses themselves too abruptly. Denise responded with breezy confidence, her voice floating through the walls with an ease that made my stomach tighten. She said I had slipped outside to get some air, that I always got emotional during the holidays, that her heart went out to me, but that I needed space. Her words felt like a blade slicing through any hope I had that someone might check on me. In the background, I heard laughter, not loud, but enough to confirm that the evening, at least for the people inside, had returned to normal. I heard the clinking of silverware against plates and the pop of a champagne cork. The holiday playlist resumed slow and soft at first, then rising into cheerful melodies that drifted out into the night like a cruel reminder of the warmth I could not reach. I felt a tremor run through my chest that was not shivering, but something deeper, something like heartbreak layered with betrayal. It occurred to me that they truly believed I had walked outside voluntarily into -10 degrees Celsius. Martin knew better. He had seen me fall. He had seen the glass shatter. He had seen my body hit the snow. The realization that he could sit at the head of the table and eat dinner while I lay nearly frozen beneath the window made something inside me collapse, in a way the fall had not. I tried to lift my hand again, aiming for motion rather than escape, but my arm felt like it belonged to someone else. A wave of dizziness rolled through me, and I felt the cold loosen my awareness in slow, dangerous increments. I forced myself to stay conscious by repeating a mental checklist. Name, location, date, temperature, injuries. I recited them silently until my breathing steadied. Then I heard Lily's voice. She was live streaming again, her tone bright and practiced as she spoke to her followers. She talked about the menu, the decorations, the gifts under the tree, and her plans to apply for schools in California. I heard her say something about wanting a better view for her video, and her footsteps moved closer to the window. For a terrifying second, I thought she might open the curtain and look outside. If she did, she would see me. I tried to force a sound from my throat, even the faintest cry for help, but the cold had wrapped itself around my vocal cords until the only thing that escaped was a weak exhale. Then I heard her say, "No, the lighting is better over here," and her footsteps drifted away. A soft wave of despair washed over me, heavier than the snow beginning to settle on my dress. More sounds followed, blending together into a painful soundtrack of normal life continuing only a few feet from my frozen body. A spoon scraping the bottom of a bowl, glasses clinking in a toast. Denise's laugh ringing out too loudly, a sign she was drinking more than usual. The guests complimented the meal, complimented the decorations, complimented the atmosphere, oblivious to the fact that someone was slowly freezing outside the house. At one point, I heard one of the men say something like, "Where did she go again? The daughter right, Emily. She has been gone a long time." Denise replied quickly, assuring him I often took long walks when I was overwhelmed, especially during the holidays. She said she understood how emotional I could be considering my history. She said it with a sympathetic sigh that felt theatrical enough to make me want to scream. Then the front door opened briefly. I heard the wind rush in, followed by the muffled sound of someone stepping outside onto the porch. I held my breath. Maybe this was it. Maybe someone was finally looking for me. The footsteps paused. I waited for someone to step off the porch and walk toward the yard. Instead, I heard a man say, "Yes, it is cold all right," and then a moment later the door closed again. The last sliver of hope flickered out in my chest. Inside the house, the conversation shifted to business deals and investments. Martin's voice joined in steady and well-controlled as if the entire incident upstairs had never happened. He talked about expansion goals, about winter shipping routes, about profits and risks. Listening to him speak so casually while I lay half frozen made me realize that if I died outside that house, he would convince himself it had been an accident. He would tell people I wandered out, got lost in the snow, or slipped on ice. He would believe his own story. I felt another wave of numbness spread up my arms, a sign that the cold had begun to overtake my body at a dangerous pace. I forced myself to wiggle my fingers, tiny motions that felt monumental. My mind drifted in and out, anchoring itself to whatever sound it could find. But every sound inside the house carried the same message. They were not coming. They were not worried. They were not even curious. I was alone in a world that had moved on without me, a world only a wall away. The moment my mind began slipping into that strange borderland between consciousness and surrender, the world around me shifted in ways that felt both frightening and strangely comforting. The cold had seeped so deeply into my bones that I could no longer tell where my body ended and the snow began. My breaths were shallow and slow, drifting into the night like fading smoke. I felt myself drifting not in the peaceful way people describe falling asleep, but in the terrifying way patients used to drift in trauma rooms when their vitals dropped. In the emergency room, I had watched countless people fight the numbness that came before slipping away. Their eyes would lose focus, their voices would soften, and their hands would curl inwards as if trying to hold on to something they could not see. I used to grip their shoulders and tell them to stay with me, to stay awake to fight the pull. Now those words echoed in my mind as if spoken from far away. Stay awake. Stay awake. I tried to follow the command, but the darkness creeping in from the edges was gentle and inviting. It felt like warm water closing over my ears, muffling the world. That was when I saw her. At first, it was only a blur of movement near the edge of my vision, something soft and pale standing a few feet away. I blinked slowly, unsure whether my eyes were truly open or if I was imagining the world through a haze. But the shape sharpened, and I saw my mother standing in the snow, wearing the same winter coat she used to wear when she walked me to school. Her hair was loose around her shoulders, blown lightly by a wind I could no longer feel. She looked exactly as she had before she became sick, healthy, and warm, her cheeks rosy from the cold. For a moment, I thought I had finally slipped too far and was hallucinating. But the fear that should have accompanied that realization did not come. Instead, a strange calm settled over me, a sense of safety I had not felt since childhood. She stepped closer without disturbing the snow. Her footsteps silent, her presence so gentle, I felt tears sting my eyes despite the cold. "Emily," she said softly, her voice exactly as I remembered, warm and steady, the voice that always soothed me when storms shook our house. "You cannot sleep yet. You must stay awake." I wanted to reach for her, but my arms remained frozen at my sides. I whispered something, though I could not tell if any sound actually left my mouth. She knelt beside me, tucking a strand of hair behind my ear the way she used to when I cried after nightmares. "You have survived things colder than this," she said. "Not weather. People." Her words stirred something buried deep inside me. Memories flickered behind my eyelids like scenes from an old home movie. I saw myself standing on the porch at 15, shivering while Martin watched from the window. I saw myself at 10, sitting alone at the kitchen table long after the dishes were cleared because I had not finished an assignment quickly enough. I saw myself at 17, packing a suitcase quietly while my father slept terrified that he would wake and stop me. These memories did not come with the sharp pain they usually carried. Instead, they felt distant, softened by the presence of my mother. "You fought for your life long before tonight," she said. "Do not stop now." A wave of warmth spread across my chest, brief but powerful, as if the memory of her love created a temporary barrier against the cold. I inhaled slowly, the breath uneven but present. Then her expression shifted not with fear, but with urgency. "Someone is coming," she whispered. "You must stay awake for them. Do not close your eyes. Promise me." I tried to answer, but my voice faded into the wind. She smiled, sadly touched my cheek, and began to stand. "Wait," I wanted to say. "Stay." But before I could form the words, her figure dissolved into the snow-filled night as gently as she had appeared. The darkness rushed back in around me heavier than before. I blinked slowly, trying to anchor myself to the fading warmth her presence had left behind. My mind drifted to the emergency room again, remembering the countless times I had coached patients through hypothermia symptoms. I used to explain how the body shivers to generate heat, how the mind begins to wander when the core temperature drops too low, how the world becomes soft and dreamlike. Now I was the patient. I needed to follow my own advice. Do not sleep, keep breathing. Focus on something real. I looked toward the house, though the windows were still dark from where I lay. I listened for familiar voices, but the sounds had changed. Conversations grew distant. The laughter was gone. The music had stopped. For a moment, I thought everyone had left the house, but then I realized my hearing was fading. The cold was winning. My heart hammered weakly in my chest, each beat slower than the last. I forced myself to move a finger. Just one. I pictured the tendons and nerves, imagining them firing like tiny sparks under my skin. My index finger twitched. I tried again. A slight curl. It was almost nothing, but it was enough to pull me back from the edge. Then I heard something new. Not the laughter from inside, not the wind, but the faint crunch of snow from somewhere down the road. It was distant, irregular, not steady like a pedestrian, but heavy like a car slowing on icy ground. My mind tried to focus on the sound, but the darkness pushed in harder. I felt myself slipping again, sinking into the cold that wanted to claim me. I thought of my mother's voice. "Someone is coming. Stay awake." The crunching sound grew louder, closer, until it became clear that a vehicle was approaching the house. Hope flickered inside me, fragile but real. I forced my eyes open wider, just enough to see the faint blur of headlights reflecting off the snow. Someone was here. Someone had come, and all I had to do now was hold on just a little longer. The crunch of tires on ice grew louder until the sound filled the night like a lifeline pulling me toward consciousness. Headlights swept across the snow, casting long shadows that shifted over my half-frozen body. For a moment, I feared it was Martin's guests leaving their cars, the final proof that the night would end without anyone realizing I was missing. I forced my eyes open wider, my lashes stiff with frost, and tried to focus on the blurry beams cutting through the darkness. The vehicle slowed near the driveway, its engine humming steadily. I recognized the shape even before my mind fully registered it. A dark blue sedan, old but well-maintained, the kind of car driven by someone who valued reliability over appearance. Aunt Margaret. I did not know how I recognized it in that state, but my brain clung to the memory of her car from years ago when she would visit on holidays before Denise quietly pushed her out of the family's inner circle. Margaret, my mother's older sister, had always been the one person besides my mother who saw through Martin's charm. She had tried to stay involved in my life after my mother died, but Martin found ways to make her feel unwelcome, claiming she interfered too much, that she undermined his authority. Eventually, she stopped coming by, except on rare occasions. I had not seen her in nearly 2 years. Yet here she was, her car slowing as if guided by instinct toward the patch of yard where I lay. The headlights flashed across my face, and I felt a flicker of hope surge through me, sharp enough to momentarily override the numbness. The car door opened with a creak, and I heard her boots crunch through the snow. She muttered something about visiting the cemetery earlier, her voice carrying frustration and sorrow. Then she said she wanted to drive past the house just to check if the lights were still up for the holiday. I tried to call out, but my voice was too weak to form words. The only sound that escaped my throat was a strained breath. She took a few steps toward the porch, turning her head slightly as if listening to something. I willed myself to move to make any noise, but my frozen body refused to obey. Margaret paused. Something had caught her attention. Maybe it was the way the snow near me was disturbed. Maybe it was the faint contrast of my dress against the white ground. Or maybe it was the instinct of someone who had always worried that Martin could push too far. She stepped away from the walkway and moved toward the yard. Her boots crunched closer. I forced my fingers to twitch once more, hoping the small movement would catch her eye. She gasped. I heard it clearly, a sharp inhale of shock that sliced through the quiet night. "Emily," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Oh my God!" She hurried the last few steps and knelt beside me, brushing snow from my face with shaking hands. Her touch felt like fire against my frozen skin. I tried to speak, but only a faint sound came out. She leaned closer, her breath warm. "Stay with me, sweetheart. I am right here." She cupped my cheeks, turning my face gently toward her. Her eyes widened as she took in my injuries. Then she looked up at the house, at the darkened window above, and her expression shifted from fear to fury. She reached into her coat pocket with trembling fingers and pulled out her phone. I watched her dial with urgency. Her voice became firm, clear, the voice of someone who refused to be ignored. "This is an emergency," she said. "My niece is unresponsive and severely hypothermic. She may have spinal injuries from a fall. We need an ambulance immediately." She gave the address with steady precision, her hands shaking only after she ended the call. She looked down at me again and whispered, "I tried calling earlier. He said you were out running errands." Something felt wrong. I should have come sooner. A tear slid down her cheek, falling onto my frozen skin like a tiny bead of warmth. "Stay awake, Emily. Do not close your eyes. Help is coming." I blinked slowly, acknowledging her even though my vision blurred at the edges. Margaret removed her scarf and wrapped it around my neck, then took off her coat and covered my torso. She moved carefully, knowing sudden changes in temperature could be dangerous. She kept her hands on my shoulders, applying the slightest pressure, grounding me to reality. She spoke constantly, refusing to let silence swallow me. She told me about visiting my mother's grave earlier, about how she had brought flowers and stood there longer than usual because she could not shake the feeling that something was wrong. She said she had tried calling the house twice, but Denise answered and insisted everything was fine. Something in her voice sounded off, Margaret said. She sounded too cheerful, too rehearsed. That is why I drove by. My breaths grew shallow again as the cold pulled at my consciousness. Margaret noticed and leaned closer, her voice urgent. Do not sleep, Emily. Listen to me. The paramedics are on their way. Stay with me just a little longer. She grasped my hand, trying to stimulate circulation. When she saw my fingers barely respond, she whispered a string of prayers under her breath. Then her attention snapped upward again. The front door opened. Martin stepped onto the porch, blinking into the darkness. I felt Margaret's grip tighten. He called out, sounding irritated rather than worried. Who is out there? Margaret stood, placing herself between me and the house like a protective barrier. Her voice was steel. Stay where you are, Martin. Do not take another step. Silence fell heavy over the yard. Martin hesitated, then retreated slightly into the doorway, muttering something unintelligible. Margaret knelt beside me again, her voice softening. He is not coming near you, sweetheart. Not tonight. Not ever again. Sirens echoed faintly in the distance, growing louder by the second. Light flickered across the sky as emergency vehicles approached. Margaret looked down at me, tears in her eyes, and whispered, You are safe now. I have you. Hold on. The wail of the approaching sirens cut through the stillness of the night, growing louder until the sound vibrated through the frozen air around us. Red and blue lights flickered across the snow, casting sharp streaks of color that made the scene look surreal, almost cinematic, as if I were watching someone else's emergency instead of living my own. Margaret stayed beside me, one hand gripping mine, the other stroking my hair gently to keep me focused. Her presence felt like the only thing tethering me to consciousness. The first paramedic rushed toward us with a medical bag slung over his shoulder, followed closely by another carrying a thermal blanket. Both men dropped to their knees beside me with practiced urgency. One of them introduced himself, speaking clearly but calmly, while the other immediately checked my pulse and then pressed 2 fingers lightly against my wrist. He looked up at the first paramedic with a seriousness that sent a shock of fear through me. Her pulse is weak and slow. Severe hypothermia likely. Possible spinal trauma. We need to stabilize her now. Margaret moved back only enough to give them space, wiping tears from her cheeks as she answered their questions. She told them how she found me where I had been lying, how long I might have been outside. She mentioned the fall and pointed toward the broken window, her voice thick with disbelief and anger. The paramedics exchanged a glance that said they understood the implication. This was not an accident someone simply walked away from. One of them touched the side of my neck, feeling gently for signs of spinal damage. Emily, he said, can you hear me? Blink twice if you can hear me. I forced myself to blink, though the motion felt heavy and strained. He nodded and said, Good. We are going to help you. Do not try to move. They wrapped a thermal blanket around my torso, tucking the material carefully beneath my shoulders to prevent unnecessary movement. The sudden warmth made my skin sting painfully, as if waking from a long numbness. A cervical collar was placed around my neck, the plastic edges cold at first, then strangely reassuring. One paramedic positioned a backboard beside me while the other prepared medical equipment. I heard the click of a radio, the murmur of codes relayed to the hospital, and the crunch of snow as more responders arrived. A police car pulled into the driveway, and 2 officers stepped out their flashlights, sweeping across the scene. Margaret stood wiping her face before pointing toward the house. He is inside, she said sharply. He knows exactly what happened. The officers exchanged a glance, then split up, one approaching the porch, while the other approached me and the paramedics. The officer kneeling beside me asked gently, Did you fall or were you pushed? His voice was careful, controlled, but the question carried weight. I tried to speak, but my lips trembled too violently for words to form. The paramedic leaned down and said, Do not force it, Emily. We need you to breathe slowly." Margaret stepped in, her voice steady with a conviction I could not muster. She did not fall. I saw the window. She landed almost directly below it. Someone pushed her. The officer turned his flashlight toward the shattered glass above and made note of the direction of the shards lying around me. He nodded slowly, his expression tightening. He told Margaret he would speak with the others inside the house. Meanwhile, the paramedics prepared to move me. They coordinated each step, lifting me onto the backboard with as little jostling as possible. Even with their caution, a bolt of pain shot down my spine and into my ribs, forcing a strained gasp from my throat. One paramedic murmured reassuringly, "We know it hurts. Stay with us. We are almost done." Once I was secured with straps across my chest, hips, and legs, they carried me toward the ambulance. The cold air against my face felt softer now that I had some warmth wrapped around me, but the dizziness grew stronger. The world tilted and blurred. Inside the ambulance, the paramedics worked with focused efficiency. They placed heating packs along my sides, monitored my vitals, started warm intravenous fluids, and slipped an oxygen mask over my mouth. The heated air inside the ambulance filled my lungs with a gentle burn that reminded me I was still alive. One of the paramedics leaned close and said, "Emily, your body temperature is dangerously low. You did everything you could by staying awake. We are going to take care of the rest." The back doors closed with a heavy thud, sealing me inside a cocoon of urgent movement. Through the small window on the door, I saw Margaret speaking with the officers, her hands gesturing sharply as she pointed toward the house. I knew she was telling them the truth, the part I was too weak to say out loud. The officers eventually entered the house. I could not hear what was said, but I knew exactly how Martin would react. He would deny. He would blame the fall on carelessness or emotion. He would portray himself as the concerned father overwhelmed by an adult daughter who was struggling. Denise would support his every word. Lily might stay silent or agree with whatever version of the story protected her own comfort. The paramedic inside the ambulance glanced toward the house as if reading the same script in his mind. He shook his head slightly, then focused on adjusting my oxygen flow. I heard him radio ahead to the hospital, providing updates about my condition. He mentioned possible frostbite on my fingers, decreased sensation in my legs, and the need for spinal imaging. I listened to every word, both terrified and strangely comforted by the familiarity of medical language. When the ambulance finally lurched forward, racing toward the hospital, the vibrations of the road sent subtle tremors through my body. The paramedic placed a hand on my shoulder and said, "We are almost there. Stay with us, Emily. Do not drift." I blinked slowly in response, anchoring myself to the voice, the warmth of the blankets, and the faint hope that the nightmare unfolding behind me would finally be recognized for what it was. The bright fluorescent lights of the emergency department hit my eyes the moment the ambulance doors swung open, a harsh contrast to the freezing darkness I had been trapped in. The paramedics moved quickly, rolling my stretcher across the slick floor toward a trauma bay where a team of nurses and physicians were already waiting. Even in my drifting state, the familiarity of the setting struck something deep inside me. I had spent years working in rooms just like this, guiding patients through fear and panic, and now I was the one lying helpless beneath the glare of overhead lamps. A doctor leaned into my line of sight, his face partially obscured by a surgical mask. "Emily, I am Dr. Archer. You are safe now. We are going to assess your injuries. Can you hear me?" I blinked once, slow and heavy. He nodded, understanding the signal. A nurse clipped a monitor to my finger, while another started warming blankets that were placed carefully along my torso and legs. Heated air from a forced air warming unit began to flow across my skin, almost unbearable at first, as the contrast startled my frozen nerves back to life. The pain that followed was sharp and deep and all-consuming. Dr. Archer instructed a nurse to draw blood for labs, checking my electrolyte levels and measuring how severely the cold had shifted my body chemistry. They worked with a precision I recognized, each person moving with practiced urgency. As they cut open the sleeve of my dress to look at my arm, one nurse sucked in a breath at the sight of my hand. Her voice softened. "This looks recent. What happened?" I could not answer, but Margaret, who had followed the ambulance and stood just outside the bay, stepped forward. She explained the fall, her voice steady at first, then shaking as she described finding me in the snow with the window shattered above. I watched Dr. Archer's eyes narrow at the details. He glanced toward the officer stationed near the door and said, "Make sure someone documents that window." The officer nodded and began taking notes. The trauma team continued their work. They started warm intravenous fluids through a line in my arm, monitored my core temperature, and checked my pupils with a small light. My vision blurred at the edges, shadows drifting into the corners of the room as exhaustion pulled at me. I fought it as best I could, remembering my mother's voice urging me to stay awake. I listened to the staff communicate their voices layering into a familiar rhythm. I heard the nurse beside me say, "Temp is coming up slowly, but she is still critically low." Another said, "Oxygen saturation stable but shallow." Dr. Archer ordered imaging. "We need spinal and chest scans immediately. Possible fractures." They lifted me with extreme caution to transfer me from the stretcher to the radiology bed. Even the smallest movement sent a bolt of pain shooting through my ribs and lower back, forcing a strained sound from my throat. A nurse leaned close and whispered, "Breathe through it." "You are doing well." I tried to focus on her voice, on the warmth spreading through my veins from the heated fluids, on the knowledge that for the first time that night I was surrounded by people who wanted to save me rather than pretend I did not exist. The scans were agonizing, requiring me to remain still while machines hummed and clicked around me. When they finished, I was transferred back to the trauma bay where Dr. Archer reviewed the results. He returned to my bedside with a sober expression. "Emily, you have a compression fracture in your lower spine and 2 rib fractures. You also have frostbite stage 1 in your fingers. None of these are life-threatening with proper care, but if you had been outside any longer, the hypothermia alone could have killed you. You were minutes away from cardiac failure." His words landed heavily, each one pressing into my chest. I felt a tear slip from the corner of my eye, not from pain, but from the terrifying confirmation of how close I had come to dying alone in the snow. Margaret moved to my side, her hand trembling as she brushed my hair back. "Thank God I drove by," she whispered. "Thank God." The officer who had followed us from the house stepped closer. "Miss Carver?" he began. "We need to know if you can tell us what happened before you fell." I tried to speak, but the oxygen mask muffled my attempt. Dr. Archer intervened gently. "She cannot talk yet. She needs to stabilize first." The officer nodded but remained nearby, jotting notes in a small notebook. A few minutes later, another officer arrived whispering something to the first. Their expressions hardened. The first officer then approached Margaret and said, "Martin is not at the house anymore. He left in his car before we arrived." "Denise claims she has no idea where he went." Margaret's face darkened with anger. "Of course he left," she said bitterly. "He always runs." The officers exchanged another look, and one of them said they would put out a bulletin to locate him. As the room shifted and voices blurred together, a nurse checked my temperature again. It had risen, but still hovered dangerously low. She told me the next few hours were critical. They would keep me under observation, continue active warming, and monitor my heart closely. She squeezed my hand and added, "You are going to get through this." I wanted to believe her. I tried to hold on to the sound of her voice, to the warmth slowly returning to my limbs, to the fact that for the first time in hours, the cold was no longer devouring me. Yet the reality of what had happened still loomed heavy and suffocating. I had not slipped. I had not wandered outside. I had been pushed. And the man responsible for it was somewhere out in the night already rewriting the story in his mind. As another wave of exhaustion rolled over me, I clung to one thought. I survived. And now the truth would have to follow. The hours that followed unfolded in a blur of steady beeping monitors, whispered conversations, and the quiet shuffle of nurses checking my vitals, yet beneath that haze, a different kind of storm was beginning to build. This one had nothing to do with weather, and everything to do with truth. Detective Harris arrived just after sunrise, a tall man with tired eyes who carried a notebook like an extension of his hand. He introduced himself to me gently, understanding that waking in a hospital bed after a near-fatal night required more care than interrogation. He asked if I felt ready to answer questions. I blinked slowly, signaling yes. My throat was too raw to speak without difficulty, so he told me to use 1 blink for no and 2 for yes when needed. Before he began, he spoke with the nurse at my bedside to understand my condition. He wanted to know exactly how severe the hypothermia had been, how long I might have been outside, and what injuries we already knew about. When he finally turned his attention back to me, his tone shifted from clinical interest to protective concern. He asked whether I remembered the fall. 2 blinks. Yes. Did you slip? 1 blink. No. Did someone push you? 2 blinks. Yes. My heart pounded as the truth left my eyelashes in quiet confirmation. The detective nodded slowly, his pen scribbling across the page with purpose. He asked who had been upstairs with me. 2 blinks again. He asked whether it was Martin. 2 blinks. A heaviness filled the room, not from fear, but from the weight of finally being believed. Margaret stood in the corner near the window, her arms crossed tightly, her face stone hard as she watched. She seemed to absorb every detail, storing it for the moment she would inevitably confront Martin again. Detective Harris closed his notebook and assured me he would gather every piece of evidence he could find. He said cases like this depended on more than testimony. They needed proof solid enough that no one could twist it into anything else. By mid-morning, 2 officers visited the house and returned with information that made even the seasoned detective lift an eyebrow. The first piece of evidence came from the neighbor 2 doors down. Their security camera, a small door-mounted device with a wide lens, had captured part of the incident. The angle did not show the push itself, but it recorded the sound of the window shattering, followed by my scream and the muffled thud of my body hitting the snow. It also caught Martin's voice inside the house, yelling something indistinct but filled with anger. The device time-stamped everything. The footage also confirmed that no one came outside afterward, even though the lights inside flickered with movement. The detective replayed the recording for me on his tablet. Hearing my own voice, faint and broken, sent chills through me sharper than any winter wind. The second piece of evidence came from social media of all places. Lily's live stream from that night had continued broadcasting longer than she intended because she apparently forgot to turn it off after setting her phone down. The video captured audio of the dinner table after my fall. In the background, you could hear Denise calmly telling the guests I had walked outside to get fresh air. But even through the muffled microphone, her tone sounded rehearsed too, composed too quick. At one point in the live stream replay, Lily whispered urgently to Denise, saying, "Should we check or something?" And Denise replied, "Absolutely not. Stay inside. We do not need a scene." The detective paused the recording, then looked at me with an expression that mixed disbelief and sadness. "They knew you were out there," he said quietly. "They chose not to act." The third piece of evidence came in the form of text messages retrieved from Lily's phone after she voluntarily handed it over, shaking with guilt when the officers questioned her. One message from Denise read, "Do not go outside. Do not say a word. Everything is fine. Stay calm." Another said, "We cannot involve police tonight. It will destroy everything." When Detective Harris showed me the texts, a numbness spread through me that had nothing to do with cold. Seeing their choices in writing in their own words stripped away any doubt about what happened. It was not a mistake, not confusion, not panic. It was a decision to leave me in the snow. The fourth and final piece of evidence came from the emergency room itself. Dr. Archer documented every detail of my condition, including the compression fracture rib injuries and frostbite. He also noted the pattern of bruising on my shoulders and forearms consistent with being grabbed or shoved. His medical report was clear and concise, lacking any room for interpretation. The detective told me it was one of the strongest pieces of evidence in the case. When all the evidence was compiled, Detective Harris returned to my bedside with a folder under his arm. He did not open it immediately. Instead, he sat in the chair beside me and said something I did not expect. "This is not your fault, Emily. People like your father depend on silence. They depend on fear. But you survived long enough for the truth to speak for you." I felt tears gather in my eyes. Not from pain, but from the quiet validation I had never received growing up. Margaret stepped closer and placed her hand on mine, her expression fierce with protectiveness. "We will not let him rewrite this," she said. "Not this time." The detective nodded and promised he would issue a warrant for Martin once officers confirmed his location. He also said Denise would face charges related to failure to render aid. As he stood to leave, he paused and looked back at me. "Sometimes justice moves slowly," he said, "but it moves. And with everything you have endured, it will move for you." When the door closed behind him, I sank deeper into my pillows, my mind spinning, not from confusion, but from the realization that the truth was finally out of the shadows. For the first time since the fall, I felt something warm spread through me that had nothing to do with the heated blankets. Relief. Not complete, not perfect, but enough to remind me that survival had meaning beyond simply staying alive. By the time Detective Harris and two uniformed officers drove back to Martin's house, the winter sun had risen just enough to cast a pale gray light across the icy yard, revealing the shattered window, the disturbed snow, and the emptiness of a home that still pretended nothing had happened. Margaret insisted on coming with them, refusing to stay behind at the hospital. She told me she needed to face him to look him in the eye and hear whatever lies he planned to tell before the truth shut them down. I could not go with her, of course, but the thought of her standing on that porch in my place gave me a strength I had not felt in days. As their vehicles pulled into the driveway, Denise appeared at the door wearing a robe cinched tightly around her waist, her hair styled carefully enough to make it obvious she had taken time to prepare before answering. She plastered on a look of surprise, even confusion, greeting the officers with a breathy, "Oh my goodness, what is happening?" The act dissolved the moment Detective Harris stepped forward. "We need to speak with Martin immediately. This is regarding the incident last night." Denise froze. Her eyes darted from Harris to Margaret, landing on Margaret with clear irritation. She hesitated before saying, "Martin is resting. He was very shaken by everything yesterday. He will need a moment." Harris did not wait for her permission. He gestured to one of the officers who stepped past her into the house. "We will find him." Denise's expression crumbled into panic. "Wait! You cannot just walk in." But it was already too late. The officers moved efficiently, searching room by room. Margaret followed Harris into the living room, where the remnants of last night's dinner still cluttered the table. Empty wine glasses, half-eaten dessert, folded linen napkins, and a faint scent of roasted ham lingered in the warm air. Everything looked disturbingly normal except for the silence. Harris pointed to the shattered window above. "That matches the injuries sustained by Emily." Denise's eyes flicked to the window, then back to him. Her voice trembled with forced innocence. She slipped. She was upset yesterday. She needed air. She climbed out on her own. Margaret stepped forward, her tone slicing through the room like a blade. "Do not lie. You left her in the snow." Denise's mouth tightened. She lifted her chin as if summoning the strength to keep lying. "We thought she needed space. She always storms off. We did not know she was hurt." "You knew exactly where she was," Margaret fired back. "You told Lily not to go outside. You told her not to say a word." Denise's face drained of color. Before she could respond, one of the officers returned. "Martin is not upstairs. His car is gone." Harris exhaled slowly. He had predicted this outcome, but seeing it confirmed ignited a deeper resolve. He turned sharply to Denise. "When did he leave?" Her throat bobbed. "I do not know." He was upset. He needed to clear his head. "You expect us to believe he left his daughter injured on Christmas Eve to clear his head?" She did not answer. Another officer stepped forward from the hallway holding a small tablet. "Sir, you need to see this." The officer played the neighbor's security footage showing the shattering glass and the sound of my body hitting the ground. Denise's eyes widened with dread. The recording continued capturing Martin's voice yelling something indistinct. Harris paused the video. "This is enough probable cause for a warrant." Denise's voice cracked. "You do not understand. He did not mean to hurt her. It was an accident." Margaret laughed, a sound filled with disbelief and fury. "An accident!" He shoved her out of a window. He watched her hit the ground. He closed the curtains. "And you did nothing." Denise's composure crumbled. Her hands trembled as she pressed them to her face. "We panicked. We did not know what to do. Martin said calling for help would make it worse. He said she would come back inside." Harris's expression hardened. "You chose to protect him instead of her. You chose silence. That is not panic. That is neglect. Lily appeared at the top of the stairs, her eyes swollen and red, holding her phone in both hands like a lifeline. She descended slowly, each step heavy. When she reached the bottom, she whispered, "I am sorry." She held out her phone toward Harris. I let them look at everything. I told them what happened. Denise spun toward her. "Lily, stop talking." Lily flinched but did not retreat. Her voice shook as she faced the detectives. "I heard him yell. I heard the glass break. I saw him close the curtains. I wanted to help her, but Mom told me not to. I thought she would wake up. I did not think she would die." The last word broke into a sob. Margaret's expression softened toward Lily, but Harris maintained his focus. "Thank you," he said. "Your honesty matters." Denise's voice erupted again, desperate and wild. "She is just a child. She does not know what she saw. She is confused. She is emotional." Harris cut her off. "We also have text messages, surveillance footage, and the medical report. Nothing about this case is unclear." He stepped closer. "Denise, you are under investigation for failure to render aid. You may be facing charges." Denise's knees buckled and she grabbed the back of a chair. But the scene was not over. The front door swung open and another officer entered, carrying a small envelope dampened by snow. "Sir, this was found in the mailbox." "It has Martin's handwriting." Harris opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The words were frantic, scrawled in messy strokes. "I did not mean to hurt her. It was an accident. I cannot face jail. I am leaving for a while. Tell them she slipped. I will explain later." Margaret read over his shoulder, her face twisting with disgust. "Running like a coward," she muttered. Harris folded the note and tucked it into the evidence bag. "This will be added to the case." Denise sank into a chair, trembling. Lily clung to the banister, tears streaming down her cheeks. Harris looked at both of them. "This investigation will move forward. We will find him, and he will be held accountable." Margaret straightened her shoulders and spoke with icy certainty. "He will not hurt her again. Not ever." The officers gathered the remaining evidence, photographed the broken window, and prepared to leave. As they walked out, Harris turned to Margaret. "She will need you." Margaret nodded, her jaw set with determination. "She has me. Always." The Fairbanks courthouse looked colder than the winter outside when the day of the hearing finally arrived, its stone walls rising against the pale sky, like an immutable reminder that truth, no matter how delayed, always demanded its moment. Margaret wheeled me through the front doors, slowly careful of the brace supporting my lower back. The lobby was crowded with people waiting for their cases, but the moment we entered, several turned to look, whispers floating behind hands as recognition spread. Word had traveled quickly in a small Alaskan town, and almost everyone already knew pieces of what happened. The official proceedings began after Martin was finally located 3 days earlier, hiding at a remote cabin belonging to a former co-worker. Officers had taken him into custody without resistance, though he reportedly insisted the entire situation was a misunderstanding. As Margaret and I waited outside the courtroom, Detective Harris approached with a stack of documents under his arm. "Emily," he said with a quiet nod, "today is not the final decision, but it is the step that will determine how the charges move forward. You do not need to speak if you are not ready." I nodded in gratitude. I did not want to talk. The idea of hearing my own voice shake while describing what Martin did filled me with a nausea deeper than anything caused by my injuries. When the bailiff called the case, Harris guided us into the room. The judge, a stern woman named Judge Pierce, sat with an expression that conveyed neither sympathy nor judgment, only the quiet command of someone who had overseen more tragedies than the public ever realized. On the opposite side of the room sat Martin, wearing a wrinkled dress shirt and an expression that flickered between forced calm and fragile arrogance. His eyes locked on me, immediately widening in disbelief, as if he had not expected me to appear at all. For a brief moment, I saw something dark flicker across his face, a mix of worry and resentment. Denise sat behind him, clutching a tissue. Her shoulders hunched, her face pale. Lily sat beside her, head bowed, refusing to look at either of them. The hearing began with the state attorney outlining the charge's first-degree assault for the act of forcefully pushing me out the window, reckless endangerment for leaving me exposed to dangerous conditions, and criminal negligence for the failure to seek medical care afterward. Each charge was read aloud, the courtroom silent, except for the steady clicking of the stenographer's keyboard. When the prosecutor finished, she presented the evidence collected by the police. First came the surveillance footage capturing the sound of the breaking glass and the impact of my fall. Then the live stream from Lily's phone capturing Denise's instructions not to check on me. Then the medical records detailing the injuries that aligned perfectly with the height and angle of the fall. Finally, she played the audio recording of Lily's interview where she admitted witnessing Martin close the curtains in the immediate aftermath. The courtroom shifted with discomfort. A few spectators exchanged glances, their collective judgment forming silently in the air. When it was Martin's attorney's turn, he stood with a smooth, practiced confidence and began insisting that Martin had been under extreme emotional distress, that he never intended to harm me, that he had consumed alcohol and misjudged the situation. He also argued that my injuries indicated I could have slipped on my own. Judge Pierce interrupted him. "Counsel," she said, "the medical report clearly states the injuries are consistent with a downward push. Please proceed with factual claims only." Margaret's hand tightened on the handle of my wheelchair, and a small breath escaped her as if she had been waiting for someone in authority to finally call out the lies. The attorney continued insisting that Martin was a respected man in the community, that he had raised Emily after the tragic loss of her mother, that he had always been under tremendous stress providing for the family. His voice filled with feigned compassion. "He made a terrible mistake, but he is not a criminal." The words nearly pulled a bitter laugh from me. If anything, they revealed how easily abusers disguised cruelty beneath obligations they never earned. When the judge asked Martin if he wished to speak, he stood slowly. He looked around the room as though searching for allies, but none met his eye. Not even Denise. His voice trembled as he began. "I did not push her. She fell. She was upset. She stormed off. She has always been dramatic. This is being blown out of proportion." I felt my heart rate spike monitors in my memory chirping as if I were back in the trauma bay. Even now, standing in a courtroom surrounded by evidence and witnesses, he still held tightly to the narrative where he was the victim and I was the burden. Judge Pierce raised a hand, cutting off his excuses. "Mr. Carver, do not attempt to minimize events documented by multiple independent sources. Your behavior following the incident is especially concerning." She flipped through her notes. "You did not call for help. You left the property. You attempted to influence witness statements." Her gaze hardened. "These actions are not consistent with innocence." Martin sank back into his seat, face flushing with anger. Denise dabbed her eyes but said nothing. Lily stared at her hands. Then the prosecutor called Margaret to the stand. She approached with a dignity that filled the entire room. Her voice steady as she recounted finding me in the snow, describing the stillness of my body, the cold on my skin, the terror that she had arrived too late. When she spoke of looking up at the house and seeing the curtains closed, her voice cracked, but she did not break. She ended her testimony with a single chilling sentence. "They left her to die." The courtroom was silent. Even Martin looked shaken. When the arguments concluded, the judge prepared to issue her decision about whether the case would advance to trial. She reviewed the notes again, then looked directly at Martin. "Mr. Carver, the state has provided substantial evidence supporting each charge. Given the severity of the injuries, the corroborating accounts, and your actions following the incident, this court finds probable cause to move forward. You will remain in custody pending trial." Denise gasped. Martin's head snapped upward as if struck. He began to protest, but the judge ordered him to sit down. Then she addressed Denise directly. "As for you, you will also face charges for failure to render aid. You chose to ignore a person in clear medical distress. Your actions will be reviewed separately." Denise burst into tears. Lily covered her face, sobbing. When the hearing concluded, officers escorted Martin away. For the first time in my life, I watched him look small. Truly small. Not because I diminished him, but because the truth had finally stripped him to the bone. Long after the hearing ended and the courthouse emptied of spectators and murmured gossip, Margaret and I returned to her home in Fairbanks, where the silence felt strangely warm, as if the walls themselves understood I needed space to breathe after the emotional collision of the morning. I sat carefully on her living room sofa, wrapped in a thick wool blanket, my back brace pressing firmly against the cushions. Snow drifted past the windows in slow patterns, the soft hiss of the heater filling the quiet while Margaret brewed tea in the kitchen. The exhaustion in my bones felt deeper than any injury, but beneath it pulsed a nervous curiosity. Margaret had said earlier she needed to talk to me privately after the hearing, that there was something she had waited years to tell me. Something connected to my mother and the life I had lost long before the night Martin pushed me from the window. When she finally returned, she set the tea tray on the table with a careful hand and sat across from me, her face solemn yet steady. "Emily," she began, her voice softer than I had ever heard it, "there is something you deserve to know, something I promised your mother I would reveal when the time was right." I felt a small knot form in my stomach. "What do you mean?" Margaret folded her hands in her lap. "Your mother knew Martin had a temper. She knew he struggled with control and that he became a different man when he felt threatened. But she also knew he loved you once, and she hoped he would always protect you. When she became ill, everything changed. He was not equipped to handle the stress, the grief, or the responsibility. So before she passed, she made arrangements. She reached into a drawer beside the sofa and pulled out a thick envelope sealed with a faded gold sticker. She set it on the table between us. "This is her trust, Emily, your inheritance. It was created to ensure you would always have security no matter what he did." I stared at the envelope without touching it, my heartbeat loud in my ears. "Martin never told me about anything like this." Margaret nodded. "He could not. He was never the trustee. Your mother appointed me. The trust remained sealed until your 30th birthday. But you turned 32 months ago." I blinked, stunned. "Why did you not tell me then?" Margaret inhaled deeply. "Because the trust was designed to activate only if you were living independently. When you moved back into Martin's house, the terms required that I wait. Your mother wanted to protect you, not fund him." My hands trembled as I reached for the envelope. Inside was a notarized document, several financial statements, and a letter written in my mother's delicate handwriting. Seeing her script again after so many years felt like being touched by a ghost, gentle yet piercing. I unfolded the letter with trembling fingers. "Emily, my love, it began. If you are reading this, life has taken you to a place I hoped it never would. Your father struggles with his own shadows, but you must never let them become your own. This trust belongs to you, and only you. Use it to build the life you deserve. You were born with a kindness stronger than fear, and the world will try to dim that, but you must not let it. I will always be with you. Love, Mom." Tears blurred the words until they melted together. Margaret placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. "When your mother died, Martin tried to access this. He pressured me. He threatened me. He tried to claim that you needed him to manage it, but your mother predicted that too. She made the trust airtight. Only you could open it, and only once you were old enough to understand its purpose." I swallowed hard, a mix of grief and anger stirring inside me. "Does he know it activated?" Margaret shook her head. "He knows the money existed, but he believed it was gone. He believed I had closed the account. He never imagined your mother outsmarted him." It took a moment for the magnitude of her words to settle. The trust was not small. The documents revealed a carefully managed fund worth more than I could have imagined. My mother had saved every penny she could invested wisely and left behind a foundation strong enough to rebuild a future from the ground up. For the first time in my life, the weight of Martin's control began to slip. He no longer had financial power over me. He no longer had the ability to manipulate my circumstances. Margaret continued, "Emily, your mother wanted you to know the truth. She loved you fiercely. She feared what grief might turn Martin into, and she wanted to ensure you would always have a way out if you needed one." A trembling breath escaped me. All this time, I thought I came back because I was helpless. I thought I had failed, but the truth was that my mother had seen everything before it happened. She had loved me so thoroughly that she prepared a path I never knew existed. Margaret nodded, her eyes glistening. She knew he might eventually turn his anger toward you. She hoped he would not, but she prepared for the worst. And when I found you in the snow, I knew her fears had been justified. I felt a rush of warmth flow through my chest, not from the tea cooling on the table, but from the memory of my mother's gentle hands, her soft laugh, her quiet strength. For so long I had carried the ache of losing her like an old bruise, tender and unresolved. Now I understood she had never truly left. She had been protecting me long after her death, guiding me in ways I never recognized. Margaret placed the trust papers into a folder and handed it to me. "This is yours. You can use it to leave Alaska if you want. You can start fresh. You can go back to Seattle. Whatever you choose it without him." For the first time in years, I felt the possibility of freedom expand inside me like a deep breath taken after surfacing from icy water. I looked up at Margaret, gratitude overwhelming me. "I will not let his darkness follow me anymore." Margaret nodded firmly. "That is exactly what your mother wanted." The day of sentencing arrived with the kind of sharp, dry cold that made every breath feel crisp enough to cut the inside of your lungs. It had been weeks since the hearing that determined Martin would go to trial, and during that time, the investigation had only strengthened the case. Witness interviews, forensic reports, timestamps, and the neighbor's security recording formed an undeniable chain of truth. Denise had accepted a plea agreement for failure to render aid, and Lily had been placed in mandatory counseling after providing full testimony. But Martin refused every deal offered to him, insisting until the last possible moment that the entire situation was exaggerated, that the fall had been an accident, and that everyone else was overreacting. When Margaret wheeled me back into the Fairbanks courthouse for the sentencing hearing, my stomach twisted with a mixture of dread and certainty. I knew today would not erase what happened, but I hoped it would finally draw a boundary he could never cross again. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense, a low hum of murmured conversations filling the space as people took their seats. Word had spread through town, and even strangers felt compelled to witness the conclusion of a case that had shaken their community. Judge Pierce entered, her expression unchanged from the previous hearings, composed and unreadable. The bailiff called the case, and Martin was led in by deputies. His wrists were cuffed, but his posture remained defiant, chin lifted slightly, eyes sweeping the room until they landed on me. Something flickered across his face, a strange combination of shock and resentment, as if he still believed I had no right to exist outside his control. Denise sat behind him, pale and trembling, wearing a probation officer's badge of presence. Lily sat beside her shoulders, tense eyes fixed on her hands. The prosecutor began by reviewing the charges once more. First-degree assault, reckless endangerment, criminal negligence, conspiracy to conceal injury. Each charge felt heavier spoken aloud, yet necessary. When she finished, she handed the judge a binder filled with evidence, including the medical reports, the live stream audio, and a transcript of the neighbor's recorded footage. Judge Pierce flipped through each section, occasionally making brief notes. Then she looked at Martin. "Mr. Carver, before sentencing, do you wish to make a statement?" His attorney leaned close and whispered something urgently, but Martin straightened and shook him off. He looked directly at the judge. "I loved my daughter," he said, voice trembling with artificial sorrow. "I made mistakes, but I am not a criminal. She was always difficult, always emotional. She pushed me. She slipped. This whole thing has been twisted into something it is not. I never wanted to hurt her." The lie slithered through the air with such practiced ease that for a moment it reminded me of every childhood argument he had twisted into my fault, every moment he caught me off guard, and convinced me I had imagined the pain he caused. But Judge Pierce would not be moved by theatrics. She interlaced her fingers and leaned slightly forward. "Mr. Carver," she said calmly, "the evidence demonstrates a pattern of violent behavior manipulation and abandonment of basic moral responsibility. Your daughter nearly died. Her injuries were consistent with force. Your actions afterward only compounded the harm." She gestured to the binder. "The court does not base its decisions on emotion but on fact, and the facts before me today are overwhelming." Martin's attorney attempted to interject, but she raised a hand. "Enough. I have heard your arguments and reviewed them at length. Now we proceed." She turned her attention to the prosecutor. "Does the victim wish to speak today?" she asked gently. Margaret looked at me. I nodded. Slowly, she pushed my wheelchair forward until I was positioned where the judge could see me clearly. My voice felt unsteady as I began. I did not describe the fall. I did not explain the cold or the pain or the moment I wondered if I would die alone behind that house. Instead, I said something simpler. He had many chances to save me, and he chose not to. Judge Pierce bowed her head for a moment, her expression somber. "Thank you, Ms. Carver." She turned her attention back to Martin. "Please rise for sentencing." He stood, shoulders stiffening as though bracing for an impact he still believed he could avoid. The courtroom fell silent. "For the charge of first-degree assault, I sentence you to 7 years in state custody. For reckless endangerment, 2 years to run concurrently. For criminal negligence, 1 year to run consecutively. You will also be required to complete mandatory counseling for anger management and undergo psychological evaluation." Martin's mouth fell open. 7 years. He shook his head, disbelief twisting into simmering fury. "This is insane. I am her father." Judge Pierce responded without raising her voice. "Biology does not exempt you from accountability. You endangered her life. The law will not ignore that." Denise sobbed quietly, pressing a hand to her mouth. Lily cried too, though her tears carried guilt rather than defense. A deputy stepped forward to escort Martin away, but he jerked his arm back long enough to throw one last look at me. A look not of remorse but of disbelief that his power over me had finally ended. As the deputies led him out, the judge delivered her final ruling. A no-contact order is issued effective immediately. Mr. Carver is prohibited from any direct or indirect communication with the victim. There will be no exceptions. She struck her gavel. "Court is adjourned." The sound echoed through the room, final and irreversible. Margaret exhaled a shaky breath beside me. "It is done," she whispered. "It is really done." And for the first time since the fall, I felt something inside me loosen. Something bound tightly for years finally releasing. Not joy, not triumph, but peace. A quiet, steady peace that spread through my chest like warmth returning to frozen limbs. The weeks following the sentencing unfolded like a slow unwinding of a tightly coiled spring, each day loosening a tension I had carried for so long that my body barely remembered what it felt like to exist without flinching at sudden noises or bracing for criticism before speaking. Recovery was not a straight line. It never is. My fractured ribs ached each time I laughed, coughed, or tried to roll over in bed. The compression fracture in my lower spine required careful monitoring, regular physical therapy sessions, and a rigid brace that forced my posture into an upright position that felt almost symbolic, as if I were being physically reminded that I had survived the worst and now needed to stand tall again. Margaret converted her guest room into a small sanctuary for me, complete with a recliner chair that helped me sit without aggravating my injuries, and she filled the house with soft lamps that kept shadows from gathering in the corners. Every morning she brewed coffee while I sat at the kitchen table wrapped in a blanket, feeling the quiet hum of a home that held no threat. Sometimes she talked, sometimes she let the silence settle around us like gentle snow. Healing began with those small moments where safety did not need to be earned. Physical therapy became the anchor of my new routine. 3 days a week, Margaret drove me back to the hospital where therapists guided me through careful movements designed to strengthen the muscles around my spine. They taught me how to bend again without fear, how to restore the grip in my weakened hand, how to trust my body after it had been pushed past its limits. I moved slowly at first, each exercise feeling like a negotiation between pain and progress, but with time, the exercises became easier. One therapist, a woman named Claire, reminded me often that healing was not about erasing what happened, but about reclaiming what had been taken. "You survived the fall," she said one afternoon as she helped me stretch my lower back. "Now you learn to rise from it." Her words stayed with me. The emotional recovery was more complicated. Nightmares came often in the first month, vivid memories of falling through the broken window, or lying helpless in the snow while the world moved on without me. I would wake with my heart-pounding lungs tight, hands shaking as if the cold had seeped into my bones again. Margaret always heard me. She would appear in the doorway with a soft lamp and a blanket sitting beside me until the fear dissolved enough for me to breathe again. She never pushed me to talk before I was ready. She just stayed unwavering and patient. When my doctor finally cleared me for travel, Margaret offered to accompany me back to Seattle to explore my options for returning to work. The idea of returning to the city where I had built my life before everything collapsed filled me with equal parts hope and worry. Could I handle the noise, the pace, the reminders of the career I once had? More importantly, could I walk back into a hospital without my body remembering the cold floor of the trauma bay and the sound of monitors tracking my failing pulse? But I knew I needed to try. We arrived in Seattle on a foggy morning, the skyline rising through the mist like the silhouette of a life waiting to be reclaimed. I visited my old hospital not as an employee, but as a visitor, meeting with the nurse manager who had once been my mentor. She welcomed me with open arms, but after reviewing my medical limitations, she explained gently that returning to emergency nursing might not be sustainable. The physical demands were too intense, the risks too high. For a moment, disappointment washed over me like a familiar ache. Nursing had been more than a job, it had been a calling. But the manager leaned forward and told me something that shifted everything. Your experience, your empathy, your resilience, these are not tied to the trauma bays. There are other places in this field where you belong. She connected me with a mental health clinic in the city specializing in trauma counseling for victims of domestic violence. They were searching for someone with medical experience and personal understanding to join their team in a hybrid role, supporting patients emotionally while helping coordinate care. When I met the director, she listened to my story with eyes full of compassion, but without pity. You are exactly the kind of person we want here, she said. Someone who understands survival not as a clinical term, but as a lived truth. I accepted the position a week later. Margaret and I moved my belongings from Alaska into a small apartment not far from the clinic, a place with large windows that let in soft light and enough space for me to breathe deeply again. Adjusting to my new role felt both familiar and foreign. I sat with patients as they recounted their own stories of fear and resilience, and each time I felt a quiet recognition, a shared understanding that did not require explanation. I understood their tremors, their hesitation, the way their voices wavered when describing the person who hurt them. But I also understood the bravery it took to walk into the room at all. Slowly, the work helped me reclaim parts of myself I thought were gone forever. I learned to speak my story without shaking. I learned to trust my instincts without doubting every decision. I learned that healing was not about pretending the past never happened, but about choosing a future that honored the strength it took to survive. On evenings when the air was cool and my back felt strong enough, I would take short walks along the waterfront, tracing the outline of the city lights against the dark water. I no longer feared the night. I no longer felt the cold as an enemy waiting to swallow me whole. Instead, I felt something steady inside me, something rooted and unwavering, a sense of self that had survived the fall and risen from the snow. Margaret stayed with me for several months, filling my apartment with warmth and stories of my mother helping me rebuild not just my physical strength, but the foundation of a life that finally belonged to me. And with each passing day, I felt the quiet but powerful truth settle deeper into my heart. I was no longer defined by the window or the cold or the man who pushed me. I was defined by my healing, and I was finally free. Spring arrived in Seattle with a softness I had nearly forgotten existed, a gentle warmth that settled over the city and replaced the biting cold I once feared would claim my life. By then, months had passed since the sentencing, months spent rebuilding the pieces of myself that Martin had spent years trying to fracture. My back had grown stronger, my hands steadier, my breath easier. But the deepest transformation was inside me, in the place where fear had once lived like a permanent tenant and where resilience now rooted itself quietly but firmly. One Saturday morning, a letter arrived addressed in handwriting I did not recognize. Margaret handed it to me with raised eyebrows, and we sat together at my kitchen table as I carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a formal notice from the Alaska Department of Corrections granting victims the option to receive updates on inmate transfers, status changes, or appeals. Attached was a handwritten note from the victim advocate assigned to my case. She wrote, You have the right to know you are safe. Please contact us if you wish to participate in future hearings. I read the words slowly, letting the reality sink in. Martin was no longer a ghost lurking behind every quiet moment. His reach had been severed. His voice no longer shaped my decisions. After finishing my morning coffee, I walked outside into the mild breeze, passing the small garden Margaret tended on the balcony. The city shimmered in the sunlight, the kind of clear day where even strangers seemed to breathe easier. I had been avoiding one particular task for weeks, aware that it would be emotional, aware I needed the right moment to face it. That moment had finally arrived. Margaret drove me to the airport, sensing without words what I planned to do. She squeezed my hand before I boarded and said, "Your mother would be proud." The flight back to Fairbanks was quiet, the landscape below shifting from green to white as we crossed into Alaska. When I arrived, I rented a car and drove toward the house where everything had changed. Snow still lined the edges of the road, though the season was turning. The sky was pale, almost silver. As I pulled up to the house, I felt my breath catch. The broken window had been replaced. The curtains were drawn. The yard was quiet. It no longer felt like my childhood home. It felt like a monument of everything I had endured. I stepped out of the car slowly, my boots crunching on the thin layer of frost. The cold brushed against my skin, like a memory, a reminder, but no longer a threat. I walked toward the side of the house where the window of my old room faced the yard. I stood beneath it, looking up at the place where Martin had pushed me into the frozen night. A place that once symbolized terror now felt strangely distant, almost like a story that had happened to someone else. My breath formed a faint cloud in the air. I closed my eyes and remembered the sensation of falling the weightless moment where I did not know if the world would ever touch me again. I remembered the sound of the snow beneath me, the cold swallowing my voice, the pain radiating through every bone. And then, just as vividly, I remembered Margaret's voice calling my name when she found me. I remembered the warmth of the emergency room blankets, the doctor telling me I had survived, the judge declaring that Martin would never hurt me again. When I opened my eyes, the fear that once lived inside me had dissipated completely. I reached out and placed my hand against the exterior wall, feeling the cold seeping through the wood. But this time, it did not scare me. I was not that woman lying helpless in the snow anymore. I was someone who had stood in a courtroom and spoken the truth even when her voice trembled. Someone who had rebuilt her life piece by piece. Someone who had chosen healing over hatred. I stepped back and took one last look at the window. Then I whispered softly, almost to the wind, "You did not break me." Turning away from the house felt like closing a chapter I had waited years to finish. I drove to the cemetery where my mother was buried, the familiar white stones rising in neat lines along the hillside. I found her marker easily and knelt down, brushing away the snow that had collected around it. "Hi, Mom," I said quietly. "I am okay now." I told her everything, not in detail, but in feeling. I told her about the clinic in Seattle, about the patients who trusted me with their stories, about the nights I no longer woke shaking, about the mornings where the sunlight felt like hope instead of something unreachable. I told her about Margaret and how she had become my anchor through the darkest winter of my life. And I told her about the trust fund she left me, the one she created, because she feared what Martin might become. I placed my hand on her stone. "You saved me long before that night. Thank you." As I sat there in the cold, I felt a warmth spread through me, not physical, but emotional, something deep and grounding, as if her love had wrapped itself around me again. When I finally returned to Seattle later that evening, my apartment felt different. Not because anything had changed inside it, but because I had changed. I stood at my window looking out at the lights of the city and realized the truth I had been circling for months. The fall did not define me. The cold did not own me. Martin did not shape my future. I did. The justice system had held him accountable, but the real victory was mine. I lived. I healed, and I refused to carry his darkness with me any longer. I turned away from the window and whispered to myself, almost like a promise, I am free. And for the first time in years, I truly believed it. If you have ever walked through a cold that was more than weather, if you have ever survived a home that tried to silence your truth, I want you to know this. You are not broken. You are not invisible. You are not alone. Your story matters, your voice matters, and your healing matters. If my journey resonated with you even a little, share your experience in the comments. Someone out there may need your strength the way I once needed someone else's. And if you want more stories like this, I hope you will stay and subscribe.